So let's bring this home. Because understanding the threat means nothing if you don't act. And action, in this environment, isn't about picking stocks or timing markets. It's about recognizing the 2008 stage is being set again. Only this time, the trap is tighter, the stakes are higher, and the exits are sealed. The thesis is clear. 2008 was a successful rehearsal for a controlled demolition orchestrated by financial elites who learned exactly what they needed to refine their playbook. The 2025 collapse won't be a market correction. It'll be a deliberate, engineered crisis designed to implement a global financial reset, eliminating cash, installing central bank digital currencies, and creating a surveillance and control system you cannot escape. They've already shown you the script. Inflate debt to unsustainable levels, sell toxic assets to the public while insiders exit, crash the system when positioning is complete, offer a pre-built solution that consolidates power. Repeat until total control is achieved. Ignoring this means financial ruin. Not because the stock market might drop 20%, but because the entire architecture of wealth storage has been weaponized against you. Your 401k locked behind penalty walls, your bank account subject to digital surveillance and potential freezes, your investments trapped in systems that can suspend redemptions during crisis. When the crash hits, you won't be able to withdraw, transfer, or protect what you've saved. But here's your edge, the knowledge the elite fear. You can see the pattern, and seeing it means you can position outside the kill zone before the majority realizes what's happening. Here are your choices. First, reduce exposure to penalty-locked retirement accounts. I'm not saying liquidate your 401k today and pay the taxes. I'm saying stop treating it as your only savings vehicle. Redirect new contributions to accessible accounts, even if it costs tax advantages. A 25% tax hit today beats a 70% wipeout tomorrow when systems freeze and markets crater. Second, build cash reserves outside the banking system. Not digital cash in a bank account that can be frozen or bailed in. Actual currency you physically hold. Yes, inflation erodes cash value, but liquidity during crisis is worth more than chasing yield that vanishes when you can't access it. The 1929 businessman survived because he held cash when everyone else held assets they couldn't liquidate. That lesson still applies. Third, diversify into hard assets they can't digitize or confiscate easily. Physical gold and silver, held personally, not in an ETF that's just another paper claim. Land if you can afford it, preferably productive land that generates food or resources. Tools, skills, relationships with people who can produce real value. The things that matter when paper wealth evaporates. Fourth, watch what the insiders do with their own money. When Jeff Bezos sells billions in stock, when sovereign wealth funds shift massively to gold, when corporate executives dump shares at record rates, they're telling you something. They have information you don't, and they're positioning for impact. You can't match their scale, but you can follow their direction. Fifth, understand the digital currency trap before it's implemented. When the crash comes and they offer CBDCs as the solution, you need to recognize it's not a rescue, it's a cage. Adoption will be framed as inevitable, as the only way to restore stability. Resist it as long as possible. Use alternative systems, barter networks, parallel economies that preserve some independence. But the reality is, most people won't do any of this. They'll keep contributing to retirement accounts they can't access in crisis. They'll keep their wealth in banks that can freeze accounts or impose bail-ins. They'll trust the system because trusting is easier than preparing, because normalcy bias is powerful, because nobody wants to look paranoid. And when the crash hits, they'll be the ones refreshing their 401k app, watching the number shrink, clicking withdraw and seeing processing delays, calling customer service and hearing we're experiencing high call volumes, discovering too late that the exits they thought existed were sealed years ago. The analogy holds. If 2008 was the dress rehearsal where they tested the systems, 2025 is opening night with your financial future as the price of admission. Will you be an actor who saw the script and positioned accordingly, or audience who paid to watch their own destruction? The choice is yours. Blindly follow the reassurances, trust the experts who failed you in 2008, believe this time is different and the system will protect you, or break free from the herd, recognize the pattern, and take action while action is still possible. Here's your edge, the knowledge the elite fear. You can see the pattern, and seeing it means you can position outside the kill zone before the majority realizes what's happening. The 100-year playbook is in play, the hard drop is tightening, and the build to power shift is all but complete. The difference between survival and destruction won't be intelligence, it'll be willingness to act on what you see before the crowd realizes danger is real. Because once everyone tries to exit simultaneously, the digital gates close, the processing queues freeze, and the wealth you thought you had becomes a number on a screen that shrinks while you watch, helpless. Your grandfather in 1929 could grab his money and run if he saw it coming. You can't, not anymore. But you can still position outside the trap if you act now, before the system locks down, before the crisis eliminates options. The elite have built a financial weapon designed to transfer the last remnants of middle-class wealth into their control. They tested it in 2008. They refined it for 15 years, and they're about to deploy it at full scale. The question isn't whether the collapse is coming. The question is whether you'll be trapped inside when it does, or whether you prepared while there was still time. The timeline is closing. The script is written. The actors are in position. All that remains is your decision. Will you see the pattern and act, or will you join the herd in the slaughterhouse, clutching reassurances from the same experts who profit from your destruction? The wake-up call has been sounded. What you do next determines whether you survive what's coming or become another statistic in the greatest wealth transfer in human history. Choose wisely. The clock is ticking.
The only question is whether you'll see it coming before your wealth is trapped in a system designed to confiscate it. Now the mask slips, because everything they learned in 2008, every mechanism they tested, every psychological manipulation they refined, is being deployed right now. Only this time, the scale is apocalyptic, and the trap has been upgraded from a cage to a digital prison you'll never escape. Let's connect the dots explicitly. In 2008, they needed bailouts because banks were insolvent, but bailouts were messy, required congressional approval, created public backlash. So they learned. Today, bailouts are pre-authorized through mechanisms like the Dodd-Frank Resolution Authority, which lets regulators seize failing banks and transfer assets to survivors without a vote. The crisis playbook is on autopilot now, requiring no democracy, no debate. In 2008, they tested asset seizures. Remember what happened? They bailed out banks but let homeowners drown. Millions foreclosed while banks got rescued. That was the test. Could they selectively save institutions while sacrificing individuals? The answer was yes, and nobody rioted. Lesson learned. Now they're preparing the upgraded version. Central bank digital currencies aren't just about convenience. They're about control. Here's how it works. When the next crash hits and liquidity freezes and banks start failing, they'll offer a solution, a new government-backed digital currency, guaranteed safe, instantly transferable, solving all the problems that caused the crisis. People will beg for it because their banks just collapsed and their savings are trapped. But here's what they won't tell you. Digital currencies are programmable. The central bank can set expiration dates, forcing you to spend by a certain date or lose value. They can restrict what you buy. No firearms, no unapproved political donations, no travel to restricted areas. They can implement negative interest rates, directly confiscating a percentage of your holdings monthly to force consumption. And they can turn it off entirely if you're flagged as a threat. You think that's paranoia? China's done it. Their digital yuan is integrated with their social credit system. Spend wrong, say wrong things online, associate with wrong people, and your money stops working. You can't buy train tickets. You can't access certain stores. Your children can't attend good schools. It's financial slavery with a smartphone interface. And it's coming here. The Federal Reserve has been running pilot programs since 2020. The Digital Dollar Project, a partnership between the Fed and private banks, is already testing infrastructure. Legislation has been introduced in Congress multiple times to authorize a digital dollar. When the crisis hits, it'll pass in days, just like the Patriot Act, just like TARP, exploiting panic to ram through systems nobody would accept during calm. But let's talk about the engineered triggers, because this crash won't be accidental any more than 2008 was. The mechanisms are already in place. Global debt is $300 trillion, 3 times global GDP. That's unsustainable, and everyone knows it. The only question is what sparks the unwind. It could be a corporate debt default cascade. It could be a sovereign debt crisis, Italy or Japan unable to roll over bonds. It could be a cyber attack on banking infrastructure, blamed on Russia or China, providing perfect cover for a controlled demolition. Watch the signals. Commercial real estate is already collapsing. Office vacancy rates in major cities are over 25%, the highest since records began. $2.9 trillion in commercial mortgages are coming due between 2024 and 2026, and most can't be refinanced at current interest rates. Banks holding those mortgages are sitting on unrealized losses, just like 2008. When defaults spike, regional banks will fail, and the consolidation will accelerate. Energy markets are being deliberately destabilized. The push to eliminate fossil fuels before renewable infrastructure can replace them is creating shortages and price spikes. This isn't incompetence. High energy prices destroy industrial capacity, force business closures, and create inflation that justifies central bank intervention. It's a controlled demolition of the real economy to justify financial takeover. Supply chains have been intentionally fragmented. The pandemic lockdowns, the vaccine mandates that fired experienced workers, the ESG requirements that strangle logistics companies, all of it makes the system more fragile. When the crisis hits, shortages will be instant and severe, creating panic and dependence on government solutions. Food production is under attack. Farms bought up by corporations and investment funds. Regulations making small farming unsustainable. Fertilizer shortages engineered through sanctions and export restrictions. When food gets scarce, people accept anything to eat. That's when they'll introduce rationing through digital currency. Your food allotment, tracked and controlled, all for the greater good. If 2008 was a dress rehearsal, 2025 is opening night. And your life savings, your freedom, your children's future are the stakes. The bankers tested the systems in 2008. They learned that bailouts work, that the public can be conditioned to accept theft, that politicians will always choose the system over the people. Now they're running the final play. And here's the truly insidious part. When this crash hits, it won't be fixed like 2008. It'll be positioned as an opportunity for a great reset. Their term, not mine. The World Economic Forum has been promoting it since 2020. A complete restructuring of the global economy, eliminating private property, you'll own nothing and be happy, replacing cash with digital currency, replacing freedom with managed society. What if the next crash isn't an accident to be fixed, but a designed event to enslave? What if every crisis for the past century has been a step in the same direction, concentrating power, eliminating independence, building a system where escape is impossible? That's not conspiracy. That's documented pattern recognition. The elite's endgame is here. A digital financial system they control completely, where your money works only if you comply, where savings can be confiscated through inflation or programming, where every transaction is monitored and restricted. They tested the components in 2008. Now they're deploying the full system, and the crash is the excuse to implement it. The clock is ticking, the signals are everywhere, and if you don't see it coming, you'll be trapped in a system designed to extract every dollar you've saved, eliminate every freedom you value, and ensure you can never build independent wealth again. Don't say you weren't warned.
Here's the kicker. While you struggle with inflation that's officially 3%, but realistically 15% if you actually buy food and gas, the insiders are positioning for the collapse. Jeff Bezos sold $8.5 billion in Amazon stock in early 2024. Mark Zuckerberg sold $4.3 billion. Bill Gates has been selling Microsoft shares steadily for 3 years. These aren't diversification moves, these are exits. The 2008 crash was the fire drill. They learned how to shut down the exits, condition the public, and consolidate power through crisis. The 2025 collapse will be the arson they've planned all along, with your savings as the kindling and their digital control grid as the prize. The question isn't whether it's coming. The question is whether you'll see it before the trap snaps shut. Let's go deeper, because understanding what they did in 2008 requires understanding how they built the weapon in the first place. And that weapon was called a collateralized debt obligation, a CDO. If you've never heard of one, that's by design. They don't want you to understand the con. Here's how it worked. A bank would originate 1,000 mortgages, most of them subprime, meaning the borrowers were high risk with bad credit. In a sane world, those are risky loans that should carry high interest rates to compensate for default risk. But these weren't held by the originating bank. They were sold, bundled into a pool, sliced into tranches, and sold to investors as mortgage-backed securities. The magic trick was the rating. Rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch, were paid by the banks to rate these securities. And they slapped AAA ratings on them, the same rating as U.S. Treasury bonds, the safest asset on earth. How did garbage loans get AAA ratings? Because the agencies were paid to give those ratings, and if they didn't, the banks would take their business to a competitor who would. It was a rigged game from the start. But wait, it gets worse. Once you had mortgage-backed securities, banks would bundle those into another layer called CDOs. So you're taking securities made of risky mortgages, bundling them again, and creating a new product. And then, because Wall Street can't help itself, they created synthetic CDOs, which weren't even backed by real mortgages. They were bets on the performance of other CDOs. You had derivatives of bad loans leveraged 30 or 40 to 1 being sold as safe investments to pension funds and foreign governments. By 2007, the total notional value of derivatives globally was over $500 trillion. To put that in perspective, the entire global economy, every good and service produced on Earth, was about $60 trillion. The shadow banking system had created a leverage bomb 8 times larger than the real economy, and it was all built on subprime mortgages given to people who couldn't afford homes. When housing prices stopped rising, the whole structure collapsed. Homeowners started defaulting. Mortgage-backed securities lost value. CDOs built on those securities became worthless, and because every major bank had billions in these assets on their books, they all became insolvent simultaneously. Credit markets froze. Banks stopped lending to each other because nobody knew who was holding the toxic assets. The entire global financial system seized up like an engine without oil. Here's where it gets criminal. The banks knew this was happening. Internal emails from Goldman Sachs in 2006 and 2007 show executives describing their mortgage products as junk and crap. They knew the securities were garbage, and instead of stopping, they sold them harder while simultaneously shorting the same assets. Goldman famously created a CDO called Abacus, designed to fail, marketed it to clients, and then bet against it. When it collapsed, Goldman made $1 billion while their clients lost everything. The architect of Abacus was a trader named Fabrice Tour.
In internal emails, he called himself the fabulous Fab and bragged about selling securities he knew were monstrosities to widows and orphans. He wasn't exaggerating. Pension funds, European banks, insurance companies, all buying assets Goldman knew were designed to fail. And who was regulating this? Who was supposed to prevent Wall Street from turning the global economy into a casino? The Federal Reserve, the SEC, the Treasury Department, all staffed with former Wall Street executives. Henry Paulson, Treasury Secretary during the crisis, former CEO of Goldman Sachs. Timothy Geithner, who replaced him, former president of the New York Federal Reserve, which is literally controlled by the banks it regulates. The regulatory agencies weren't just captured by Wall Street, they were Wall Street. This is the pattern you need to see. The same pattern that played out in 1929, in the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, in every financial disaster for the past century. The banks engineer a bubble using cheap credit and fraudulent products. They sell those products to the public while executives quietly exit their positions. When the bubble bursts, they demand government rescue claiming systemic risk. Taxpayers foot the bill, the banks consolidate, and the cycle resets, bigger than before. But 2008 taught them something new. They learned they could get away with open fraud. Not a single major Wall Street executive went to prison for the 2008 crisis. Not one. Bertie Madoff went to prison, but he stole from rich people. The banks stole from everyone and got bonuses. The Department of Justice, under both Bush and Obama, decided that prosecuting bank executives would destabilize the financial system. So they fined the banks instead. Billions in fines paid by shareholders, not the executives who committed the crimes. Goldman Sachs paid $5 billion, J.P. Morgan $13 billion, Bank of America $16.65 billion. Sounds like justice until you realize those fines were tax-deductible and represented a fraction of the profits they'd made. Goldman paid $5 billion but made $10 billion shorting the mortgage market. The fine wasn't punishment, it was a transaction fee. Now let's connect this to 2025. Because the same mechanics are in play, only the products have changed. In 2008, the weapon was mortgage-backed securities. Today, it's everything. Corporate debt has exploded. U.S. companies have borrowed $10.5 trillion, much of it used not for productive investment, but for stock buybacks, a financial shell game where companies borrow money to buy their own shares, inflating stock prices and executive compensation. Leveraged loans, corporate debt given to already heavily indebted companies, have surged to $1.4 trillion. These are the new subprime mortgages, risky loans bundled into collateralized loan obligations, CLOs, the new CDOs, and sold to investors as safe investments. The rating agencies are doing the same thing they did in 2008, slapping high ratings on junk because they're paid to do so. And if they didn't, the banks would take their business to a competitor who would. It was a rigged game from the start. Private equity has exploded. Firms borrowing trillions to buy companies, load them with debt, extract fees, and leave them bankrupt. Toys R Us, Sears, countless regional newspapers, all destroyed by private equity strip mining. And when those over-leveraged companies fail, the loans backing them will default, the CLOs will collapse, and we'll have 2008 again, only bigger. Student debt, $1.7 trillion, most of it held by the federal government, but increasingly being securitized. Auto loans, $1.5 trillion, with default rates climbing. Credit card debt, over $1 trillion, at interest rates averaging 21%. The entire economy is a debt-fueled Ponzi scheme, and the insiders know it. But here's what makes it worse. In 2008, central banks could cut interest rates from 5% to 0% and deploy quantitative easing, buying trillions in assets to inject liquidity. It worked, barely, at the cost of inflating the everything bubble we're in now. But those tools are spent. The Fed has already done QE for 15 years. Their balance sheet is $8 trillion, ballooned with bonds they can't sell without crashing markets. Interest rates are at 5%, giving them minimal room to cut. When the next crisis hits, they're out of ammunition. Except one weapon. Central bank digital currencies. This is the end game. When the crash comes, and it will, they'll offer a solution. A new digital currency controlled by the central bank, eliminating cash, tracking every transaction, programmable to expire or restrict how you spend. They'll sell it as safety, as preventing future crises, as modernization. But what it really is a control grid. China's already done it. Their digital yuan tracks every purchase, integrates with their social credit system, and can be turned off for dissidents. The European Central Bank is launching a digital euro. The Federal Reserve has been testing a digital dollar. And when the crisis hits, they'll implement it fast, just like they did the Patriot Act after 9/11. Crisis, rescue, centralization. The records reveal the playbook. Inflate a debt bubble, sell toxic assets to the public, crash the system, demand bailouts, consolidate power. Repeat, bigger each time. 1929 led to the Federal Reserve gaining more power. The 1970s stagflation led to fiat currency untethered from gold. The 2008 crash led to central bank balance sheet explosions and negative interest rates. The 2025 crash will lead to CBDCs and the end of financial privacy. This isn't theory. This is documented history, and the pattern has held for a century.
Picture this. September 15, 2008, a Monday morning. Manhattan's financial district, normally buzzing with the arrogance of wealth, is frozen in disbelief. Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old institution that survived the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and the Great Depression, is filing for bankruptcy. $600 billion in assets, gone. The 4th largest investment bank in America, erased in a single weekend. But zoom out from Wall Street for a moment. Look at the real carnage. A schoolteacher in Phoenix opens her mailbox to find a foreclosure notice. She's never missed a payment, but her adjustable rate mortgage just reset, and her monthly payment doubled overnight. In Ohio, a factory worker stares at his 401k statement, watching 2 decades of retirement savings cut in half. In Florida, entire neighborhoods sit abandoned, homes with for sale signs rotting in overgrown lawns, windows shattered, dreams evaporated. The stock market is in free fall. The Dow drops 504 points in a single day, then 733 points 2 weeks later, the largest single-day point decline in history. Traders on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange aren't just selling, they're panic dumping everything. Blue chip stocks, municipal bonds, assets people once called safe are being thrown overboard like ballast from a sinking ship. Here's what they told you was happening. Greedy bankers made bad bets. Subprime mortgages, those loans given to people who couldn't afford homes, were packaged into something called mortgage-backed securities. Financial wizards on Wall Street bundled these toxic loans, slapped AAA ratings on them, and sold them to pension funds, insurance companies, and foreign governments as safe investments. When homeowners started defaulting, the whole house of cards collapsed. Simple story. Greed plus stupidity equals disaster. But here's what they didn't tell you. This wasn't stupidity. The banks knew exactly what they were doing. Goldman Sachs was selling mortgage-backed securities to clients while simultaneously betting against those same securities with their own money. They were shorting the very products they told you to buy. Think about that for a second. Your financial advisor hands you investment, tells you it's solid, takes your money, and then walks into the next room and bets that you're about to lose everything. That's not incompetence. That's a con. The housing bubble didn't inflate by accident. It was engineered. The Federal Reserve, led by Alan Greenspan, kept interest rates artificially low for years, flooding the system with cheap money. Lending standards were deliberately gutted. No income verification loans, called liar loans in the industry. Zero-down mortgages, interest-only payments. They handed out home loans like Halloween candy, not because they believed in home ownership, but because every mortgage could be bundled, sliced, repackaged, and sold for profit. The machine needed fuel, and your debt was the gasoline. By 2007, the cracks were already showing. Foreclosures were spiking, housing prices were falling,
Bear Stearns, another Wall Street giant, had 2 hedge funds collapse in the summer of 2007, losing $3.2 billion. The warning signs were everywhere, but CNBC kept telling you to buy. Financial advisors kept saying the fundamentals were strong. The Fed kept insisting everything was under control. Then Lehman fell, and the dominoes started dropping. AIG, the world's largest insurance company, needed an $85 billion government bailout just to survive the week. Washington Mutual, the largest savings and loan in American history, seized by regulators. Wachovia, Merrill Lynch, Countrywide, all collapsing or being emergency sold to competitors. The entire global financial system, the thing they told you was sophisticated and resilient and too complex for ordinary people to understand, was revealed to be a Ponzi scheme held together with duct tape and lies. Does this sound familiar? It should. Because the script is repeating right now, only this time the stakes are higher, the weapons are sharper, and the trap they've built is impossible to escape. But here's the kicker. 2008 wasn't a failure. For the people who engineered it, it was a spectacular success, and they learned exactly what they needed to know to pull it off again, only bigger. You're feeling it right now, aren't you? The squeeze. Gas prices that make you wince every time you fill up. Grocery bills that somehow climbed 30% while your paycheck stayed flat. Rent increases that force impossible choices. Credit card balances creeping higher because making ends meet requires borrowing from next month to survive this one. You're working harder, earning the same, and falling further behind every quarter. That's not coincidence. That's not bad luck. That's the script repeating. Here's the thesis they don't want you to understand. The 2008 financial crash was never a mistake. It was a dress rehearsal, a controlled demolition designed to test systems, refine mechanisms, and train the public to accept the unacceptable. The bankers who engineered it didn't fail. They succeeded beyond their wildest projections. And now, armed with the lessons from that trial run, they're preparing for the main event in 2025. Let me show you what they learned. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008, the government had a choice: let the criminals fail or rescue them with public money. They chose rescue. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, pumped $700 billion of taxpayer funds directly into the banks that caused the crisis. Think about that number, $700 billion. That's $2,000 for every man, woman, and child in America handed to the executives who destroyed the economy. But here's what they don't tell you about TARP. The official story is that taxpayers were repaid, that the bailout was a loan and we got our money back with interest. Technically true, completely misleading. Because while TARP was the visible bailout, the Federal Reserve was running a secret operation that dwarfed it. Between 2007 and 2010, the Fed loaned $16.1 trillion to banks, corporations, and foreign institutions. Not billion, trillion, with a T. The Government Accountability Office, not some conspiracy theorist, the official congressional auditing agency, documented this in 2011. $16.1 trillion in emergency loans, most of it at near zero interest rates to institutions that were insolvent. Citigroup alone received $2.5 trillion. Morgan Stanley, $2 trillion. Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, all gorging at the trough of free money while you lost your job, your home, and your retirement. And what did they do with that $16 trillion gift? Did they restart lending to small businesses? Did they help struggling homeowners avoid foreclosure? No, they paid themselves bonuses. Goldman Sachs posted record profits in 2009 and paid out $16.2 billion in bonuses. JP Morgan Chase, $26.9 billion in bonuses over 2 years. The people who broke the system got richer, while 8.7 million Americans lost their jobs. This is the lesson of 2008. When the crisis hits, the government will sacrifice you to save them. Not because politicians are evil, though many are, but because the system is designed that way. The Federal Reserve isn't a government agency. It's a private consortium of banks, created by banks to protect banks. When crisis strikes, their mandate is crystal clear: preserve the financial system at any cost. And you are not part of the system. You're the fuel it burns. But the real genius of 2008 wasn't the bailout mechanics. It was the psychological conditioning. They trained an entire generation to accept that banks are too big to fail, that certain institutions must be rescued no matter the cost, that moral hazard doesn't apply to the elite. You learned that when the crash comes, the rules change. Property rights, bankruptcy law, contract enforcement, all suspended when necessary to protect the system. Are you starting to see the pattern? The 2008 crash consolidated power. Lehman Brothers failed, yes, but its assets were absorbed by Barclays and Nomura. Bear Stearns was absorbed by J.P. Morgan. Merrill Lynch by Bank of America. Countrywide by Bank of America. Washington Mutual by J.P. Morgan. The crisis didn't break up the big banks, it made them bigger. In 2007, the top 5 banks controlled 35% of U.S. banking assets. By 2010, they controlled 52%. Crisis, rescue, centralization. The oldest playbook in financial history, executed perfectly. Now, they're running it again. Only this time, the stakes are exponentially higher. In 2008, global debt was $167 trillion. Today, it's over $300 trillion. In 2008, central banks had tools to fight the crisis, room to cut interest rates, clean balance sheets to deploy quantitative easing. Today, interest rates are barely above zero. After years of emergency measures, and central bank balance sheets are already bloated with $25 trillion in assets. They've already fired their bullets. And the new weapon they're preparing isn't another bailout. It's a complete reset. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, are being rolled out across the world. China already has one. Europe is testing theirs. The Federal Reserve has been researching one since 2020. These aren't just digital dollars, they're programmable money. Money the central bank can turn off if you spend it wrong. Money with expiration dates to force consumption. Money that tracks every transaction you make, eliminating privacy, eliminating cash, eliminating any escape from the system. Here's the kicker. While you struggle with inflation that's officially 3%, but realistically 15% if you actually buy food and gas,